Hello and welcome to the Briefing Room webinar series brought to you by ClimateWorks Australia. I'm John Thwaites. I'm the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and ClimateWorks Australia, and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, to sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm currently coming to you from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd also like to acknowledge participants from many locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Now, if you've been keeping an eye on the news, you'll no doubt have seen the countdown to the COP26 climate conference has begun. In less than a week, world leaders will gather in Glasgow to discuss how countries plan to tackle climate change. So, in the light of that, in today's webinar, we'll be turning our attention to an important global region, Southeast Asia. This region is the most natural disaster-prone territory in the world. In fact, it includes 6 of the 20 nations most vulnerable to climate change. And these impacts are already being experienced. One example is the increasing frequency and destructiveness and unpredictability of super typhoon events. Just think about what we saw this year with super typhoon Surigay that increased from a category 2 to a category 5 cyclone in just 24 hours. The intense tropical cyclone was a record breaker. It's taken its place in history as the 5th strongest cyclone ever recorded anywhere in the world. Fortunately, the countries in its path avoided the worst of its fury, yet it still killed at least 10 people and caused tens of millions of dollars of damages across the Philippines, Palau and Micronesia. There are also the increasing social and economic risks from rising sea levels. One estimate predicts that in 2030, a once-in-a-decade flood could see 96% of Bangkok underwater. That would spell disaster, displacing 10 million people and impacting around $512 billion of GDP. The Southeast Asian Intergovernmental Organisation is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or Asean. It's made up of 10 countries whose combined GDP make them the 5th largest economy in the world. Yet the region still has 36 million people living on less than $1.90 a day. It's therefore critically important that this region is not left behind in the global shift towards net zero emissions and the economic opportunities this will bring. In this session, we're going to interrogate why it makes sense for Southeast Asia to turn towards a green economy, and why collectively the countries that make up the region will benefit both socially and economically by taking action on emissions. We know, for instance, that all of Southeast Asia's key trading partners have made a pledge to transition to net zero emissions by mid-century or 2060 in the case of China. The Australian government announced today Australia's commitment to net zero by 2050. A welcome announcement, even if it was a bit late, but especially timed for this webinar. But will the Southeast Asian region be able to respond to the level of ambition set by the COP26? Today, our expert panel will explore what it will take to develop the region's green economy and how close trade relations with low carbon global leaders can benefit the region. It's estimated that developing Southeast Asia's green economy could provide up to $1 trillion in annual economic opportunities, generating more jobs and trade opportunities. We're already seeing some steps towards a low carbon future, but the task ahead is significant. So what are the specific challenges for this region in moving away from fossil fuel investments and towards green growth? And what are the unique opportunities that can be leveraged? Let's ask our panel, and over the next hour you'll hear from Professor Huynh Wu, a leading economist and Vice President for Asia at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, based at the Jeffrey Sachs Centre for Sustainable Development at Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Dr. Tubar Haywin, who leads the Environment and Climate Change Initiative for FHI 360 Asia Pacific. And Guntur Sutiyono, the country lead Indonesia for ClimateWorks, based in Jakarta. Now, all of you that are participating in the webinar have the opportunity to ask our panelists questions at the end. So if you do have a question, please jot it down in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So put your questions in the Q&A function and we'll try to get to as many as we can. First up, let's welcome Professor Huynh Wu, the Vice President for Asia at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a global initiative for the United Nations. He's also a distinguished professor of economics at the University of California in Davis and research professor at Sunway University in Kuala Lumpur, where he heads the Jeffrey Cheer Institute on Southeast Asia and Jeffrey Sachs Centre on Sustainable Development. Professor Wu joins us from Malaysia. Welcome, Professor Wu.
Oh, wonderful to be here. Very glad to join this discussion.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. Collectively, ASEAN countries make up the third largest economy in Asia. They're all also the fifth largest in the world, only behind the US, China, Japan, and Germany. Given that we're seeing a pledge towards net zero by 2050 from many of the region's key trading partners, what influence will this pledge have on Southeast Asian nations? And what role do ASEAN member states have in global climate action?
Well, John, there is one additional piece of information I should give you, which is that even though the ASEAN economies collectively are smaller than the GDP of Germany, but the population of ASEAN is 50% higher than that of the EU. So what it means is that their potential on the future of the world is not recognized, especially if they were to catch up. Southeast Asia, being a which get gotten rich by trading with the rest of the world, certainly recognizes the things that the rest of the world are concerned about. Specifically, we recognize that climate change is an existential threat because we see over the last year, Western United States was burning as never before, and much greater floods on the west coast of the United States. And in Europe, you have fire in southern Europe, like Greece, Italy, and Turkey, and you have floods in the northwestern part of Europe, Germany and Belgium. Then closer at home, in Zhengzhou city in Henan, so much rain fell that in 4 days, they had the equivalent of 1 year worth of rain. Extreme weather events are happening elsewhere in the world. And sooner or later, it will come to Southeast Asia, at least in the form of rises in the ocean level. So we know that of the dangers, and we also know that this is a global problem that needs collective action by everybody. So that's the incentive to act. But now there is the realization that there is great pressure on us to act quite quickly, largely because when we read the new Green Deal of the European Union very carefully, we see that it explicitly states that for trading partners of the EU that do not have pathways towards net zero emissions, the EU would start putting on border adjustment taxes on countries with poor actions on eliminating CO2. So there is, and given the fact that we have gotten rich by trading, this hurts us exactly. So we have definitely a great desire to act. And I think that we, however, have been delayed, largely because of reasons of a sense of resentment. The sense of resentment comes because most of the CO2 up there had nothing to do with us. And if we look in present terms, our CO2 per person emission is very low compared with what is happening in the EU. So we are acting out of both a sense of moral obligation and of self-survival, but there is a sense of it should be the differentiated responsibilities part of it should be emphasized. So that's how Southeast Asia would look at it.
Well, thanks, Professor Wu. Is the pathway to net zero well understood in Asian countries? And what potential are there for Asian countries to benefit from green growth opportunities as they move towards decarbonisation?
Largely because the realization of the need to act really occurs within the last 2 years, I would say. The urgency to act really came about in the last 2 years, especially after looking at the fine print of the European Green Deal, saying that border adjustment taxes would be imposed. So because our realization that actions are needed immediately is pretty recent, we do not have really developed, we have not explored well the options to decarbonization. So like my institute is working with your group, the ClimateWorks of Australia, in leading a group of ASEAN countries to study the options for decarbonization and then to quantify the costs and benefits of each decarbonization option. But one thing we do know, it will be cheaper for ASEAN to decarbonize by working together. The most obvious thing I would say is look at green energy, solar energy. The sun doesn't shine all the time on all places. That means that some places could have less sunshine at any one time than other places. So this is where a regional electric grid is exceedingly important, so that the countries with a lot of hydropower resources can be sold to other countries that may need energy during intermittent periods of where they either cannot get the wind or get the sun. So working together, we realize it's cheaper to decarbonize. The other things we know which must work together is that we are 15% of the natural forest coverage in the world. Being the tropical zone, our tropical forest is 15% of the world's forest coverage. And so we should be compensated, or we should be able to receive compensation for not cutting down our forest in order to accelerate our industrialization. And it is easier for us to get a hearing for compensation if we act collectively rather than an individual voice of conscience to the rest of the world. So there is a great desire to do it, but there have difficulties in knowledge. And also the fact you see that in none of the Southeast Asian countries do you see a green party of any importance. The domestic politics is not really a strong motivating force for decarbonization, for the simple reason that extreme weather event really hasn't happened in Southeast Asia yet. So we also need public education to mobilize the popular support that translates into political agendas for the different parties in Southeast Asia.
Yes, I think certainly in Australia, the bushfires that we went through 2019, 2020 did have an impact on public perceptions and the need for stronger action. So that point you make about education and understanding is very important. But Professor Wu, you also raised an important issue that within Southeast Asia, there would be some sense of, you could use the word resentment, that the people in the Southeast Asian countries have not contributed to most of the emissions that are causing global warming. And indeed, I think the emissions per head for Indonesia are around 2 tonnes of CO2 per year, compared to Australia, 17 tonnes. So if we're going to see significant action by ASEAN towards decarbonisation, what do high-income countries like Australia need to do to support decarbonisation in ASEAN countries?
I think the best way to describe it is that it is in the long-run self-interest of the developed world to extend technical and financial help for the poorer countries to decarbonize. The rationale is the same as in the case of why the richest man in town should fund public education for everybody. The richest man in town should fund public education for everybody is so that his daughter or their sons will have more educated spouses, in a greater choice of educated and smart spouses in the future. We are talking about collective survival. And I think to get people to move quickly, you cannot just rely on the stick. In other words, we would just impose taxes on your goods. We know that the stick doesn't always work. Look at what it has done to North Korea. We have made North Korea desperately poor with mass starvation, but those guys is like the Energizer Bunny. They keep on going because resentment is a very strong force for people to resist. So I think that when you show the generosity that the developed countries have done on many fronts, like in education, the extension of education opportunities by Australia to Southeast Asia in the 1950s to the 1980s, that has been deeply appreciated. And so I think the aid in terms of technology transfer and financial support will certainly make this accelerate Southeast Asian efforts in decarbonization. And when I say technical support, it is not just machine knowledge of new methods, but also we are talking about mass education so that the average person understands why we have to act. Because to achieve a circular economy, we need a societal-wide mobilization. Things as simple as sorting your garbage so that you could able to get recycling. It is a societal. It is not just in a few industries. It is not just the energy sector. It is the whole mindset. So the public-spirited mindset based on enlightened self-interest and the strategic mindset of if we don't act, we are going to see trade taxes on us. Together, these two changes in mindset will allow Southeast Asia to participate enthusiastically to be part of the global solution.
Well, thank you, Professor Wu. And clearly that change in mindset is critical, but as you say, it needs to be accompanied by investment, finance and technology support, as well as education and social support, which developed countries are able to assist with. And certainly Australia, as we commit to net zero by 2050 in our country, we need to commit to it globally as well. And part of that commitment is assisting our closest neighbours in Southeast Asia. So thank you, Professor Wu. And I remind the audience, if you've got any questions for Professor Wu or any of the other panelists, please put them in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. I'd now like to turn to one of the countries in the region that's very important, and that's Vietnam. In Vietnam, the impacts of climate change are expected to be particularly severe, given the country's extensive coastline and river deltas. Already extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. So Vietnam, a very important neighbour of ours, is home to, I think, around 85 million people. And Vietnam's energy consumption has grown around 4% annually since 1990 as Vietnam modernises and transitions into a modern urban economy. But agricultural emissions are also an issue in Vietnam, and Vietnam is the world's second largest rice exporter after Thailand. Other significant crops include coffee and tea and rubber and cashews. But the good news is that Vietnam has started to make strong investments in solar and wind energy. So let's look at the challenges and opportunities that Vietnam faces in the race to net zero. And let's welcome our second panelist, Dr. Tubar Haywin. Dr. Tubar Haywin leads the Environment and Climate Change Initiative for FHI 360 Asia Pacific, a non-profit human development organisation dedicated to improving lives in lasting ways by advancing integrated, locally driven solutions. She has over 20 years of experience working in climate change governance, natural resource management, and social ecological systems dynamics with UNDP. She's also worked at the Asian Development Bank and international NGOs. So, Dr. Tubar Haywin, lovely to have you with us today, and welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks, ClimateWorks, for having me today, and very good afternoon to the audience. So John just mentioned rice and coffee. So I'm wondering who in the audience that don't eat rice or drink coffee. So listen in. Right. So
I'm certainly on to my fifth coffee today.
There you go. So the question of renewable energy and our conversation towards net zero is quite interesting, because I'm sure that you read in the news that Vietnam's renewable energy leaps is one of the globe's foremost examples. 100-fold increase in solar power capacity in just 2 years, and right now ranking 7th or 6th in terms of capacity. But the surge in solar didn't come from the push to cut carbon pollution. The country isn't among the more than 100 countries with net zero target in the decades ahead. And what drove that embrace of solar is the struggle of Vietnam's utilities to get loans for new coal power plants. The growing number of power storages threatened the economic momentum. The surging electricity demand from factories, like you see a lot of multinational giants, including Samsung, Apple, opening up factories, and also the kind of stagnant economic growth over the past few years. So this is the drive. So what are the opportunities? If you look at, I just building on what Professor Wu was, indicating in terms of ASEAN collective work and inspiration among different countries of working together, you see that Vietnam is already setting as a template for other country, looking at the power generating capacity. These solar booms shows how much capacity you can build in a short period of time, as I just mentioned, 100-fold in 2 years. And also the fact that Vietnam became the third largest market for solar in 2020 has gained traction of global investors. And this has opened up a golden opportunity for ASEAN to accelerate its energy transition. Now looking more into the kind of the domestic market, just looking at one solar company, a Chinese manufacturer of solar cells and panels, investing about 320 million in a factory in a province of Bắc Giang, and estimated to generate about 3,000 jobs. And you hear this kind of success story not only in terms of kind of a big figure of dollars and jobs, but you also hear story from farmers, like friends and neighbors who have solar on their rooftop. Like this particular farmer in the news, that he has these 40 solar panels on his green house in his farm growing melons. It's about 55 miles from Ho Chi Minh City. Very good, profitable, and it's also good marketing. He can sell 6 tons of melon and making about $80-something million from selling electricity back to the grid. And so the other thing that I think quite interesting to observe in the country is that the private sector are willing to take on market risk. If you look at Vietnam, so Vietnam Electricity Vietnam has got a monopoly on transition and distribution of electricity, controlling about 60% of the markets. But you see that private sectors have already stepped up to deliver more than 3.5 times of the government plan for renewable energy. So just a couple of months ago, the industry has already surpassed the solar power target for 2025. So now it leads us to the challenges. For example, sorry, can you just hold on one? I need to stop the noise.
You know this is live anyway, don't you, when this happens?
Sorry.
Good.
Sorry. So, so when the private sector moving so fast, now can the government policies and governance structures moving equally fast? And then you have the poor infrastructure as well. When you have that creaky grid, means in some areas that you have more power than other regions. And then 2% of the total population is the poor living in remote areas. They don't yet have access to electricity of any sort. Now, can renewable energy address this issue of equity as well? And then you have issue of the financial side. The investment capital is very tight. Domestic banking has limited capacity for large upfront investment. The other big thing is, which I noticed changing a lot, but also can be a challenge, is the perception of people. Now, not many people actually appreciate the advantages of renewable energy. Like, you don't hear about it all the time. Like here, people have solar rooftop. Like, I walk around and say, hey, I have solar, and I feel kind of proud. It's it's not the same yet, and people don't feel that risk of fossil fuel, like the air pollution issues started to kind of become more prominent in the conversation. So yeah, so I just go back to the jobs discussion. You have that human resource when you all of a sudden, I mean, the world itself is facing that reskilling emergency. Asia have probably addition of 14 million jobs, green jobs by 2030. And mainly a lot of this is in renewable energy sector. Now, can Vietnam have the capacities, the technical skills? We already talked about like Vietnam has, good labor force, but are they good quality labor force? So training capacity, university, technical jobs need to be connected with private sector on that front as well. So I think I stop there.
Yep. Thanks, Thu-Ba, and thanks for fixing up the noise there. Just before I ask you the next question, if I can just urge everyone in the audience to think what are the questions you'd really like to ask our speakers about the transition to net zero in Asian countries. So put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get them. Thu-Ba, you did talk about renewables, and certainly we're seeing an incredible growth of solar in Vietnam. But what about other sectors? Agriculture, industry, transport. What are some of the real opportunities in those sectors?
Yeah, I think it's important to mention agriculture in Vietnam, and I go back to that in a second. But let's step back 1 second and look at that kind of wider context of like green growth and other issues. You already mentioned Vietnam is the top 10 countries of extreme vulnerable to climate change. And then we have the NDCs, the revised NDC in September. And it's interesting when you look at the climate the assessment of others looking at, this NDC is not ambitious enough. And then some other people say, oh, no, it's pretty high. So what is that difference in that kind of expectations of Vietnam delivering emission? A lot of it, I think, it's to do with the ability to come up with data, and the net zero accountability is receiving a lot more attention in the country, not just, setting up a target, presenting it to COP, and, the COP conversation is political, as we all know it. So go back to green growth. We have the national green growth, I think approved by 2012, and the country's been working, over the past 8 years, kind of raising public awareness, setting up foundation, institutional framework. Is kind of readiness for green growth kind of over the past few years. And now it's the time for us to leapfrog to the real kind of implementation of green growth. And it's seen as a key strategy for Vietnam. And in one of the, I think, article that I came across, he said that the green growth help to aim to make Vietnam carbon neutral economy as soon as possible, and without giving a kind of a clear indication of when. So yeah, the energy sector we just mentioned. Now the rooftop solar is considered making Ho Chi Minh City the leading city in terms of economic development, but also green growth, because they have more solar power than, say 50 times compared to 5 years ago. And then you look at transport. Hanoi is planning to build up like smart transport management system. I think there's this bus app that can tell you where the routes are, where the best route to take. And then if you know Vietnam, then you know VinFast, and together with Siemens, talking about electric buses and electric cars, and other things related to like air pollution, air quality, and waste management. And of course, these are the all main attributed to the main 5 factors of like coal power and road transportation and all that. But let's zoom in the agriculture sector a little bit, because agriculture, excluding land use change and forestry, contributes about 25% of Vietnam total emission and making it the second largest emitter behind the energy sector in the country. Now, the challenge, I mean, Vietnam is, agriculture country. So the challenge is to reduce emission from the sector and minimizing the damage from climate change to social vulnerability. But there's certain constraints like, things to do with capacity to respond to risk. The information is always the key, and also the lack of coordination in the sector. But I would say Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development is one of the kind of leading ministry in the country. Okay, so I think I stop there.
Okay. Well, obviously that you've highlighted across different sectors, including agriculture, the key challenges. I asked Professor Wu about international support, and I'd like to ask you that too. What international support should Vietnam hope to get out of the COP26, and how will that help it meet its decarbonisation goals, particularly around things like financing mechanisms, etc.?
Yes, I would have to repeat what Professor Wu was saying in terms of that usual suspect of support in terms of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. But obviously, I mean, we need adequate resources and access to greener technologies to enable that deep transformation that we're talking about. But to me, I think everything counts. And, I think someone mentioned that the definition of climate finance is becoming redundant because every dollar spent can contribute to climate change, to tackling climate change. Now, it depends on how we spend it, wisely or unwisely. And of course, to enable the good spending or the wise spending and budget allocation, there's a bunch of other governance issues, that call into focus. But I think for Vietnam, I'm Vietnamese, but I'm not going to speak for the country. This is the government is having a lot of meeting and consultations at the moment. But I think the IR6, the recent IPCC report really pointed out to the risk of the high tides. And you mentioned, John, about Mekong Delta, and I think Vietnam definitely must stress that peril of rising sea levels. And if you don't want to lose the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, which is like cutting down all this rice export, even during the pandemic, Vietnam planned to borrow about 2 billion to fortify the Mekong Delta sustainably in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And the President, Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, he mentioned several times that climate change threatens global security. And so, we have all these plans to deal with issues in the Mekong Delta, but it also depends on how successful you implement these policies. And one thing, though, that I think not a lot of people mention, but because I'm working for VHI, it's, we deal a lot with public health issues, and, the COVID crisis kind of converging with the climate crisis. You start looking at the healthcare system, and you realize that out of all this climate finance, I think it's about 47 billion up to 2019. Only 1% has gone to health sector. And how one hurricane in Puerto Rico can totally damage the entire health system of the United States back in 2017. We heard that, we know that. And so I think the issue of the equity among climate finance is for different sectors, not only just from developed countries to developing countries, need to be discussed as well. My final point on blended finance is that, when you look at looking at ODA in Vietnam as an example, Vietnam is now a middle income country, and the ODA by 2019 declined by a third. No, the ODA in 2019 is only a fourth of what was given in 2012. So only 7 years. And most of this ODA in the past has gone to infrastructure and power, and what we receiving right now is a lot less, because Vietnam is a middle income country, but also we need to think about how should we spend this money, towards renewable energy, towards green growth, and all that. I don't know if we have more time. I can talk a bit more about agroforestry sector, but let's see.
Let's come back to that in questions, because there may well be a question around agri-forestry. Look, thank you very much, Thu-Ba, and it's been wonderful to hear about Vietnam. And we're now going to turn our focus to another hugely important country, Australia's closest neighbour, Indonesia, the biggest economy in the region. Indonesia has had a very heavy reliance on coal, and was one of only 5 countries that started a new coal plant construction in 2020. Like Australia, it's also a significant exporter of coal. On the other hand, in the last year, there have been major steps forward in Indonesia in climate policy, with the government recently committing to a target of net zero emissions by 2060 or sooner, and committing to no new coal-fired power plants after 2023. This is quite extraordinary if you consider the incredible development needs of the country and the fact that Indonesians are only emitting 2 tonnes per head of CO2 compared to 17 tonnes here in Australia. Indonesia is also making strong progress to address emissions from land use and forest clearing, which are in fact the largest source of emissions for the country. Now, next year, Indonesia is due to take over the rotating presidency of the G20 group of major economies. And this will be a major opportunity to demonstrate leadership in climate policy and decarbonisation in Indonesia, and more broadly across Asean. So with our third speaker, let's unpack the challenges and opportunities that are specific to Indonesia. Our next panelist is Guntur Sutiyono, the country lead for Indonesia at ClimateWorks Australia. So it's wonderful to have you, Guntur. Guntur's team enhances ClimateWorks' understanding of Indonesia. They're responsible for assessing opportunities and acting as a trusted advisor to stakeholders. And Guntur oversees projects in sustainable finance, fiscal policy, energy, and business development. So welcome, Guntur, who's joining us from Indonesia.
Good afternoon, John. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Guntur, as I mentioned, Indonesia is Southeast Asia's largest economy, and it recently brought forward its net zero goal to 2060 or sooner, which is fantastic to see. What is the economic incentive for Indonesia to do that and to accelerate their net zero goal? And how can it put Indonesia on a green path without harming livelihoods?
Thank you, John. So first, Indonesia has a long-term goal to become a developed nation by 2045, taking advantage of demographic dividend, which would happen sometime around 2030. And already this goal is at risk due to climate change. The economic losses from climate change potentially reducing gross domestic product in developing countries by 11% by the end of the century. And for Indonesia, the 2015 forest fire cost us a loss equal to 2% of our GDP. So to make sure we reach that goal, we need to keep our pace. And accelerating the net zero is important in creating the resilient economy. Accelerating the net zero means also opening up opportunities for massive investment in green technology, because the world is already moving away from investing in brown tech. China's announcement, for example, to stop financing coal is a sign that the world's appetite has significantly moved away from coal. Emission-intensive industries will soon have to follow, as investors are demanding sustainability standards linked to 1.5 degrees target. So I echo Professor Wu, who spoke earlier, that if our commodities want to remain competitive internationally, transitioning to green practices is important. And this is also aligned with Indonesia's target to transition the skills in the jobs. Transitioning the economy, the industry will create the demand for skill transition in the workforce. So I agree again with Thu-Ba in preparing the education sector now to facilitate the transition in the next few decades. My final bit on this is that when we talk about transition in developing countries, we need to talk about just and affordable transition. And to do that, we need to know several things. First, we need to know a full picture of cost associated with the transition. This is beyond retiring and replacing the coal-fired power plants. And second, the regional impacts and interlinkages. So we don't want to create economic disparity, and which could ripple through other regions or other provinces in the country. And finally, third, how to prevent that in terms of what investments are best to compensate the impacted regions. And this is also need to consider that each region have different socioeconomic characteristics, such as population and economic size, infrastructure readiness, including the ICT infrastructure, energy supply, and the regional interaction, between one province with another. So I think this is really important to know, and when it comes to just and affordable transition, John.
Thanks, Guntur. New economic modelling by the Indonesian Ministry of Planning, Bappenas, has shown that reaching net zero by 2045 would lead to greater economic growth over the next 10 years than if Indonesia reached carbon neutrality later. Can you give me an example of the areas of future opportunity for that green growth?
Right. So number one, let me just go through what we have done so far, right? So we are successful in reducing deforestation. We are still on the track to make the forestry sector a net carbon sink by 2030. But we also have a big food estate program that would still need public watch. Indonesia start to address the issues in energy sector, like as you mentioned, through updated price for renewables, and then we also have net zero pathways in the electricity subsector. We're also moving forward with the battery industry, with new investors establishing factory producing battery for vehicles. Most recently, we officially announced to start implementing the carbon tax by next year, applying it first to the coal power plant under emission cap mechanism. And this is to add that our financial regulator is also improving sustainable finance roadmap further and working to have the green taxonomy ready soon. There's a huge opportunities in blue carbon, and some of the leading ministries in Indonesia are preparing a set of mechanism and financing and activities to ramp up the blue carbon opportunities. But what we want is that these progress are not isolated in their sectors. What we want is these progress to create a system change, and some already are. And I think this is where the government's big challenge lies: how to stitch between the long-term economic goals that I mentioned earlier, 2045 vision, etc., and the climate goals. The long-term strategy, the net zero, 1.5 degrees target.
Well, thank you, Guntur. And the other big factor, of course, is that Indonesia is about to step into the role of chair of the G20. And what opportunities do you think this will present?
Yes, so there's a couple of things. It's really interesting to hear Thu-Ba and Professor Wu spoke earlier, because there are a couple of things that I would echo again. And then this is a really timely question, as Professor Wu mentioned, that ClimateWorks, together with the SDSN and a number of organizations in Southeast Asia, are working to recommend a set of actions that countries can do. as the G20 chair, Indonesia can champion the emerging economies and developing countries' interest. And first, pushing for equitable economic recovery to make sure the global financial stability is met. And this is really important. I think Thu-Ba also mentions the equity story here. And getting out of COVID is important. So this is an example. Before even talking about the economic recovery, 37% of world population have fully vaccinated, but only 5% of population in Africa, for example, have received it. And Africa is also a major trading partner for Southeast Asia or Asian countries. So without this happening, it's really difficult to make equitable economic recovery. And second, strengthening the global financial sector's resilience, particularly from climate risk. Many developing countries' budget are getting more and more stretched from addressing climate-related natural disasters and exposed to transition risk. And this is related to what Thu-Ba said earlier about getting equitable financing to help recovering or to help this situation, this fiscal situations. Third, championing several initiatives that Indonesia have done. So again, carbon tax and carbon pricing is something that most likely we will implement next year. But we also need international taxation reform. So, an example that Ireland is joining the global minimum corporate tax agreement. So that's a kind of sign that we would like to see also happening in G20. And the above agenda need responsibility from developed countries. So we are asking the developed countries to meet their 100 billion a year promise, for example. So my final comment is, so yes, on one hand, Indonesia can lead by example in raising the climate ambition, looking at it as an opportunity rather than a burden. But most importantly, Indonesia should take the opportunity to represent developing countries and demand the responsibility of developed countries to meet their promise as well, as mentioned by Thu-Ba and Professor Wu earlier. So thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Guntur Sutiyono. Now we've got time for a few questions, and I want to jump straight into that. And a question to begin with for Professor Wu. Professor Wu, given how the governance for the Asian region is different than the EU, it's a different sort of federation, do you think that the Asian region could agree to a common interest in raising their climate ambition to tap the momentum we're talking about today? Could there be an Asian Green Deal one day, or potentially a common Asian carbon market?
As was pointed out, ASEAN does not yet have, well, I use the word has not yet have the same kind of overarching regional organizational arrangements that the EU enjoy. So the idea of an ASEAN Green Deal plan emerging soon is unlikely to happen. But just because there's no common plan does not mean that they would not be all working individually in an informally coordinated way to achieve carbon neutrality. At least three reasons for it. The first one is what I've mentioned before. It is cheaper to decarbonize collectively. Like, for example, having that regional grid and also being able to get external assistance easier by forming a union. The second reason why there would be such a collective convergence towards decarbonization is that we would come under growing pressure from our biggest economic partners, China, Japan, and the United States. While while our three biggest partners seem to be now engaged in geostrategic competition in more active ways than we like to see, one thing that we think they will work together on would be on issues like nuclear proliferation, fighting global pandemic, and in fighting climate change. Just look at China. China has just made the commitment that its Belt Road Initiative will now no longer build coal power plants in the countries that they are helping. And ASEAN countries recognize that a coal power plant has an average lifespan of 46 years, which means that by 2060, there'll be many stranded assets if they have to become near net zero emissions. So the existing technology of carbon power plant makes them converge to not building them anymore. The third reason, which we should not be cynical about, is that the ASEAN countries also have enlightened self-interest to leave behind a world to their children that is not heading towards environmental Armageddon and economic collapse. So I think it is like they care about their future generations as much as they care, and they realize that this is a common threat faced by everybody. So I see that there will be convergence in actions, and it's not necessarily strongly coordinated by the ASEAN Secretariat, but there's a lot of learning from each other that they see is necessary to bring the cost of climate actions down. Because by scaling up their actions, they are creating opportunities for them to observe ways in reducing their cost, in creating green hydrogen, and in lowering the cost of carbon capture and sequestration, and of developing longer lasting batteries.
Yeah.
I think we cannot take the cost of these technologies as given, because through increased use, the ASEAN nations, because they will be doing very similar things, they will spot opportunities of how to lower the cost of these climate actions.
Thanks, Professor Wu. A question for Dr. Tubar Haywin. You raised in your talk about the need for some form of compensation for not taking down forests, and highlighted the role of deforestation. And we have a question here, which I'll ask you. Efforts to reduce deforestation and enhance forest stocks will be central to ASEAN's transition to net zero. Key to this will be approaches that can facilitate incomes and livelihoods for local communities. Do you think that the approaches we've got in place now, REDD+, for example, and carbon markets in their current state are adequate to deliver stable incomes over the long term? And if not, what do you think needs to change?
Thanks for the question. And this is very close to my heart. The issue of forestry and nature-based solutions, carbon emission. For those who are not familiar with REDD+, is a reduced emission from deforestation and degradation. And, it's been around for about 13 years. We've been talking about the potential of cutting emission from that, as well as improving local people's livelihood and biodiversity. Now, the question is it going to deliver stable income over the long term? There are mixed evidence all over the world. Yes, I believe that, and I've seen evidence of that. But to be able to do it properly, there are a lot of things that we didn't anticipate before that need to be put in place. Things with governance, things with indigenous people, land tenure. And we've been talking about mobilizing funding from the market. It hasn't been in place yet. And we know about the LIVE Coalition that just, been established, aiming to mobilize about 1 billion in financing, in kicking this off. So there are a lot of momentums, and people talk more about nature-based solutions now. You will hear a lot in COP. But I just want us to really step back and be critical about what the conditions need to be in place before we go around and start talking about, REPLAS like 13 years ago as a quick and cheap way of cutting emissions. Long term, yes, I believe that. But to do it properly, I think we need to kind of, on one hand, you need to kind of leapfrog in terms of financing, but on the other hand, you need to take baby step in terms of putting all the governance conditions, especially working with indigenous people in place in order to ensure that long-term impacts.
Well, thank you for that. And unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time. It was a great session. I'd like to particularly thank our panelists today, Professor Wing Wu, Dr. Tubar Haywin, and Guntur Sutiyono. So thank you very much for your participation today. After today's webinar, you'll all receive an email from us with a recording of the discussion. So I do hope you can share that on your network. If you'd like to tune into our next webinar, it will be taking place on Tuesday, 23rd of November, and we'll be announcing the panelists for that webinar shortly, but please mark the date in your calendar. To find out more about our webinar series, head to ClimateWorks website. And before we go, I'd like to say thank you to our production team, Serpil from Written and Recorded, Kalia from ClimateWorks, Sophie and Lilith from ClimateWorks for their technical support. And I'd also like to make a special mention to all our philanthropic supporters and program partners. We really do value our partnership and working together. If you are interested in supporting us and learning more about our work at ClimateWorks, please feel free to reach out, start a conversation. We really would love to hear from you. Been fantastic having your company. I'm John Thwaites. Have a great week and see you next time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us. Glad. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Thu-Ba. Thank you.